Hey alumni, this is John Steele, your host and post-graduation guide. Before we jump into this week's episode, I'm wondering, would you consider giving a gift to After 4? During the month of June, our team is working to raise $50,000 so that we can keep bringing you After 4, our other alumni podcast, InterVarsity World Changers, and a host of other alumni resources. All the work we do here is possible because alumni like you and other ministry partners make it happen through your financial support. We love getting to develop these resources for you. So if this podcast has blessed you or someone you know, or if you just like the idea of helping alumni make the transition to life after graduation, please, during the month of June, consider following the giving link in the show notes and help us continue making more of your favorite alumni podcast After 4. Thanks, alumni. We're grateful for your support. Hey, InterVarsity alumni. This is After 4, your podcast for navigating life after graduation. This is both an exciting and potentially tricky transition that you're making, and you might feel a little unsure about the coming weeks and months. We're here to provide you with expert advice, practical skills, and plenty of encouragement as you learn how to keep saying yes to Jesus in your new context. This is After 4, and this podcast is for you, alumni. What's up, alumni? Welcome to After 4, your podcast for navigating life after graduation. I'm your host and guide, John Steele. Question for you: what has your life experience been with vacations? Were they a regular thing for you and your family, or are you still waiting for your first one? Were they restful, or did they just distract you from the day-to-day and you ended up going home feeling just as worn out as when you started? Next question: what do you want your vacation rhythms to be after graduation? And how does rest play a role in those plans? Well, if you aren't already, I think our guest this week is going to help you start thinking through some of those things. This week, we're joined by York Moore, CEO of the Coalition for Christian Outreach and famed TikTok evangelist. For real, if you're a TikTok user and don't follow York, start today. York is going to share a bit about his experience with vacation in his professional life and, when done in a healthy way, the role that it plays in engaging with God in some really fantastic rhythms of rest. And I know if you're just getting started at a job, thinking about vacation might feel a little premature, but I can assure you it's not. Now is the time to practice establishing healthy boundaries with your employer, especially if they've supplied you or soon will supply you with vacation days. Use them and use them well. All right, here's York, and this one's for you, alumni. York, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, John.
Absolutely. I am so glad that we get to hang out together today. York, we're going to be talking about vacations as a part of a healthy rhythm of rest. But before we jump into our topic, would you just do us the honor of giving just a brief introduction, help our listeners get to know you a little bit, York?
For sure. Well, after half a life with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, most of those years as a national evangelist, 27 years with InterVarsity.
Wow.
I've stepped into a new role just a couple of years ago. I'm the CEO and president of the Coalition for Christian Outreach, historically a regional ministry all throughout Pennsylvania. And I was hired to help nationalize this wonderful work of God. It's a college ministry. We do ministry in partnership with churches. Most of our missionaries go on staff at the local church, and we mobilize the church to do campus ministry. Part of what makes us distinct also, John, is that we have this core belief that every square inch of the world matters. Our chemistry matters, our physics matter, the way in which we practice our dentistry matters, being a stay-at-home dad matters, a soccer coach, that every single thing in life needs to be surrendered to the Lordship of Jesus Christ. I know that's not something that we own exclusively, but it's something that we really disciple students towards is vocational and academic stewardship.
I love that because honestly, York, as we step into the conversation that we're going to have today, talking about vacation, like I'm the one that asked you to do this. And even as I've asked you, I've been like, Lord, how do we talk about vacation as like something that is honoring and glorifying to you, something that's good for us? It can feel like sort of this just like, yeah, you go on vacation sometimes. And so the fact that that is the mindset that you bring in the ministry that you're in right now, it feels then like this should be a no-brainer as far as like, absolutely, vacation is something that we can surrender to the Lord, that can be so good for us, can be so strategic and beneficial as part of our rhythm of rest. And so I'm really grateful that you're the one that I'm talking to then about this, York. This will be great. So let's just start kind of big picture with this, with the idea of vacation. And I'm just going to ask why. Why is it that vacation rhythms are good for us, that they're useful as part of our rhythms of rest? And why is right now, as alumni are transitioning into full-time work professional rhythms, why is right now a good time to start thinking about those rhythms?
Yeah. Boy, how the evangelical church could use a more robust theology of leisure. We don't have a
Mm.
theology of leisure. At least if we do, it's hiding someplace. I haven't yet discovered it. And probably there are some books written on it, undoubtedly by IVP. And
Yeah,
all the
it's
good
got to
books
be.
are IVP. I am reminded one of my intellectual influencers is a guy named Miroslav Volf. He's written a great book called A Public Faith, and then a subsequent book called A Public Faith in Action. And in that book, he actually dissects a little bit about the difference between ceasing and resting. Ceasing is simply the cessation of being productive. Resting is actually, there's a lot of action oftentimes in resting. For me, what's restorative in my Sabbathing, for instance, is loading hay with my tractor for my cows,
Hmm.
or picking up cow poop in the pasture. Like that's actually fairly restorative. There's a way in which that you can see that as productive. So I'm not ceasing from activity, but I'm actually entering into a mentality and a posture of rest. And I'm doing that with the Lord.
Can we start to say just a little bit more, thinking about the difference between, that it isn't just about ceasing, that like, help as we think about the idea of vacation. Like, we don't just take a flight somewhere and then sit in a chair for the week that we're gone. Like, we do actually engage with things. Where do we start to see that line between, okay, yeah, I'm taking a step back from my work, but I'm not just sitting my butt on the couch and doing nothing? Like, where
Mm-hmm.
is that?
Mm-hmm.
How do we start to draw those lines of what is restful for me may not be restful for you, but actually withdrawing from productivity or the job that we're doing? Like, how do we start to make those distinctions of what is helpful rest versus like, I'm just I'm just trying to find other things that I'm being productive in that I haven't gotten to yet?
Yeah. Well, let's take a step back from the theological consideration and just look at it from a practical perspective. Even without going on, like my family, we're a vacationing family. We've built a
Okay.
culture of vacationing in our home, and usually that involves Mickey Mouse. We're fanatics with Disney World. We've probably been to
Nice.
parks 60 times, and now we've gotten into Disney cruises, which are wonderful. But even on a day-to-day basis, we're called to rest. We're called to find moments where we disengage, and we can take 15-minute mental health
Hmm.
breaks throughout the day. Oftentimes, however, when we do that, or we go on a vacation and we sit in a chair for a week, we come back and we say, boy, I need a vacation from my vacation. We've all heard that
Right.
phrase, right?
Yeah.
We sit on our scrolls, doom scrolling, and we wonder why we're not restful, we're not at peace. Because really, what we've done, we've just pressed pause on the things that are engaging our hearts, our minds, our souls, and we actually haven't dealt with anything. And I think that's the difference between simply ceasing and vacationing, experiencing mental health breaks, Sabbathing, taking a day of prayer. These kinds of things, they restore us because we're not simply ignoring the real world. Let's just call it the real world. It's all the real world, by the way, but that's a common construct that we use. Most people go to vacation and they just press pause in the real world, and then they resume exactly where they left off when they return. That's not how God intended us to rest. God invites us to come away, to consider, to enter
Hmm.
into a posture of being rather than doing, where we find our identity in relationship rather than production. Production is good. I'm a numbers guy. I love production. I love ROI. I like measuring all the results and these kinds of things. But my identity isn't in producing a thing. My identity is in my relationship with
Hmm.
Jesus. So this idea of abiding comes into play. This idea of sitting at the feet of the master and really doing nothing except for receiving comes into play, right? So there are lots of ways in which we could come into the conversation. I think theologically is always the place where I start, just because that's the way I'm wired. But I think we see practical expressions of how people abuse rest and think that they're vacationing or thinking that they're entering into leisure, when in reality all they're doing is escaping. And if that's
Hmm.
really all we're doing is escaping through our rest, it's never going to be restorative.
I wonder if that's also some of the place where we can consume or where we can confuse like entertainment with rest and recreation, of like, this is something that sort of distracts me, this is something that I find that that can consume my brain in a different way, and then we step away from it. We're like, I'm just as tired as I was. Like I took a break from the work that I was doing. Why don't I feel better? And because it feels like it does not necessarily engage those thoughts of like, this is me sitting at the feet of the master, of being reminded where my identity lies, as opposed to just being distracted from the other thing that I was doing.
Yeah, no, that's well said, John. I think that's exactly where we can become suspicious, and
Hmm.
that's my challenge to your listeners, is to look for the places where you're suspicious about your motives, what the promise is. There's an
Hmm.
implicit promise in vacation, and you see the brochures, you get a meta ad, and you see people lounging, laughing with their children, playing in the water, swimming with dolphins. There's an implicit promise there. And the promise isn't a bad one. The promise is restoration, connection with your children, perhaps that you don't normally have as much time as you wished you would, whole relationships with your spouse. The promise is a good one. Oftentimes, though, when you get to the vacation, it's really just about the bar, especially on certain cruise lines. It really has nothing to
Yeah.
do with restoring your relationships with your wife or children. It's really just about the bar. And so there's a little bit of a bait and switch in the
Yeah.
leisure
Wow.
world. But here's my challenge: is to get suspicious. Get
Hmm.
suspicious around what the implicit promise is that is embedded in the vacation or the trip that you're about to take, and also get suspicious where you see energy going out and not coming back. You can exert all kinds of energy. I already talked about my Sabbathing on the farm here. I can't wait till it's my Sabbath here on the farm. We moved to a farm during the pandemic with cows and goats and chickens and ducks and all the things. And my heart springs alive when it's my Sabbath day, because I get to go out and do physical manual labor. Now, for many people for whom that's their actual day job, their production, their income is tied to that productivity. That's like the worst thing. They
Yeah.
they want to do the opposite. But so rest is different for each person. Leisure is different for each person. But pay attention to the implicit promise and pay attention to the places where you're suspicious.
That feels really helpful. Are there any of those twinges as you think about you planning out your days of rest or your vacation, and saying like, okay, what are the things that I'm being promised here? And is this actually something that this space can provide? Or is that something that only like my creator can provide for me?
And oftentimes, John, I feel like we don't really even know what those temptations are or those subtle lies are until we're in the midst and we have a choice to make in the moment. I remember the cruise that we were just on about a month and a half ago. We were down in the Gulf of Mexico on a Disney cruise ship, and I hadn't read my word, I hadn't prayed for a couple of days. It just wasn't even on my mind, wasn't top of my mind. So I woke up to get a latte on one of the mornings, and outside of the coffee shop, here's a young woman reading her Bible and praying. You could just tell she
Wow.
was, her body posture was one of relaxation and engagement. And, in that moment, John, I felt a little guilty. I mean, here I am, the one, who's supposed to be doing these things. And here's this young girl who's kind of shaming me. But I think, whether or not it's, let's say you're not on a cruise ship. Let's get a little bit more practical. Let's say it's the end of the day and we finally had a break in the weather up here in Michigan, and it was 75, 80 degrees yesterday, and the sunset was beautiful. And there's a way in which we can actually consume the beauty that's around us in a way that is restorative and life-giving. And then there's a way that we can consume it just as we consume a chocolate bar or
Hmm.
something that we're purchasing at the mall. We can actually drink deeply of the beauty that's around us on an everyday basis. In my third book, Do Something Beautiful, I talk a lot about beauty as action, beauty as verb, rather than beauty as something simply out there
Huh.
objectively to be consumed. And I think actually that's God's invitation to connect with Him in a way that's meaningful and even physical. I would say that there's a way in which I'm embraced by God by the beauty in the world, whether it's a snow-capped mountain or a sunset or lapping waves of an ocean. If you're in an urban context, to me, I think the physical built environment of a cityscape is just as breathtaking as the lapping waves on an ocean. So beauty is all around us, but beauty isn't a thing to be consumed. It's actually a story to be swept into.
Wow.
So we have this biblical narrative that God created the world good. It's damaged by evil. God's redeeming all things through Christ, through his death and his resurrection. And one day he will make all things new in the apocalypse. And in that biblical narrative, we are swept into a story that is so much grander and more beautiful than simply the cycles of productivity and the ambitions that we have. There's nothing wrong
Mm.
with being an ambitious person, but allow yourself to be swept into a story. So, what a vacation can do is actually allow you the space to observe the story that you are, in fact, living. You might not be appreciating the story that you're living, but if you're a follower of Christ, you're swept into a world changing, beautiful story. And the hints are all around you. And they're really not hints. They're big flashing signs in the form of sunsets and sunrises and the smiles on babies. And, beauty is all around us. But beauty is God's invitation, I think, into being. It's God's invitation to recognizing that there's a gift giver behind that gift and to commune with him. So look also for beauty around you.
Yeah, York, you've mentioned that you and your family, you've been to Disney a number of times. That you're checking out the Disney cruises now. Was there a time before vacations for the Moore family? And if so, like what was that like before this rhythm was built into your lives? What's sort of the juxtaposition of this sort of pre-vacation life with my family to now we do this thing, and these are the ways that we've seen our lives change as a result, or our relationships change?
Yeah, there wasn't really ever a time in my family that I've been raising. I've enculturated them into vacations or rhythms that are built around vacations. But before I met my wife, I had never been on a vacation in my life. In
Okay.
fact, not only did I had never gone away on a vacation, I had never even had a staycation. I was a workaholic, absolute workaholic.
Wow.
80 hours a week plus were norms. And even when I joined InterVarsity, it was probably 2.5, 3 years before I took my vacation, before my
Wow.
supervisor caught me and said, "This is ungodly and you must take a vacation." And so really InterVarsity it helped me think through why I wasn't taking vacations, what it was inside of me that drove me toward productivity. And I certainly, growing up poor, we were homeless off and on throughout my
Mm.
childhood, so vacationing as I now know it was simply absolutely the stuff of television shows. And when I met my wife, one of the first things that I was invited to was a family vacation down to New Smyrna Beach in Florida. And it was the first time I had ever seen the ocean. It was the first time, third time I had ever been on a plane. But I went down to this vacation and I was hooked immediately. I was intoxicated with this idea of allowing myself to actually enter into rest and not feel guilty about it. Before vacations, I would describe my life as just a never-ending stream of monotonous day in, day out. It's like I was living on Groundhog Day. Every day was the
Yeah.
same,
Yeah.
and there was really, and I think the the state of being hopeless, and that's where I was without Christ. I was in this
Mm.
constant state of hopelessness and despair. Productivity is a narcotic that will mask that feeling.
Wow.
And that's really what's happening, I think, largely in North America, is that we have a workaholic bent toward things, and it's masking this underlying feeling of angst and the anxiety that we have around hopelessness. But there's hope in Jesus. So when we come to Jesus, guess what? Our productivity actually becomes more meaningful and purposed, but
Mm.
then we're also invited to let go and press into leisure in a way that's life-giving and freeing as well.
You mentioned that, really before starting a family, before being with InterVarsity, that vacation had not been a part of your life. And part of that was for very practical reasons. That you said you grew up in a family that like poverty was part of your reality. And so vacations just weren't possible. I'm assuming is that those just weren't possible. So I do want to acknowledge that some of our alumni will be stepping into practical restrictions, like that there will be things like, hey, sometimes you don't get vacation until you have put in a certain number of hours or a certain number of months of work. Sometimes you just start out with very little disposable income. And so it can almost feel like a luxurious or even like, gosh, this is sort of a privilege conversation that we're having here. So I want to acknowledge that reality, but also say that, I mean, my hope is that rest is still possible for people that find themselves engaging with those realities as they start this process of work. So what's a practical step that people can take establishing this rhythm now, whether or not those are their situations, and rather than waiting for a time that they're better suited for vacation?
Yeah, that's great observation. Yeah, I would say the first thing is get creative. There are all kinds of ways that we can cheat our way to leisure, and we don't
Okay.
want to cheat our employers. We don't want to cheat our earthly
Right.
bosses and business owners. But there are ways that you can be creative. You know, the tail end of a mandatory work trip might extend further on for yourself and for your spouse and for your little ones. I did a lot of that on staff with InterVarsity. Conferences that I was going to when I didn't have the money to vacation. I'm already there. I've already flown over to Orlando, and now guess what? I'm gonna stick around. Airbnbs are highly competitive, very inexpensive, but I understand even for that, there's a life stage, I think, particularly as we start our careers and our families, where the disposable income that we were accustomed to earlier now all of a sudden is going to diapers and formula, and those can be a car payment
Right.
in and of themselves. But I would say get creative. Maybe there are friends of the family who have places where you can stay. Certainly, everybody has access to our nation's great national parks, usually
Hmm.
within a half a day at the most, probably of a drive. So there are ways that you can be creative. I think of my friend Ken Shakamitsu in Vancouver, who runs the 10th Church in Vancouver, one of the largest churches in Vancouver, and he's written a wonderful book. The title is escaping right now, but it's basically a devotional journey for urban dwellers, where life is full and there's lots of noise and these kinds of things. We can create places of leisure and rest, even in places that are busy, even in places that are distracting. And so it doesn't have to be this get away to a private island. Certainly, that would be my preference to get away to a private
Yeah.
island.
Sounds
Hasn't
great.
yet happened yet, John. But we can actually build in rhythms of rest within our means. God is good, and He will make a way. We can build in places of rest where there doesn't seem to be a
Mm.
way to rest. We just have to get creative. And here's a challenge, I think, particularly for your listeners that are going to be on a track towards real wealth. And that will be many of them. Many of them will find themselves 20, 30 years from now in a place of real privilege and wealth. You don't have to own the things in order to
Mm.
enjoy the things.
Yeah.
You don't have to own the second home. You can rent the second home. There's nothing wrong with that. And guess what? You won't have to pay insurance. And when the hurricane comes and blasts it out to the ocean, you won't have to worry about it because it's not
Yeah.
yours. So I actually have lived, in my opinion, a very wealthy life because wealth is not riches. I think there's a teaching that I apply to everything, that for every good gift of God, there's always at least one counterfeit and one perversion. And the
Wow.
gift that God wants to give His children is the gift of wealth. But we hear that word and we think riches. Riches is really not about having stuff; it's about stuff having us. It's about debt load and the anxiety of controlling the things and managing the things that we have. Wealth is being untethered, not having to labor to own those things. I have
Wow.
access to those things. I'm a very wealthy person. Now, on the perversion side, however, I think poverty is a great perversion. Poverty is a great evil, and it destroys lives, it destroys communities, it destroys culture. Poverty is something we need to work to alleviate and eradicate wherever we see it. But God's invitation to us is to embrace wealth, and wealth is not pursuing riches. So that's a challenge, I think, for some of your listeners are going to find themselves in tracks where financial restraints are always going to be a challenge. Others are going to, increasingly experience greater levels of wealth, and neither one is better or worse. In both scenarios, you can actually choose a path of wealth. You can choose a way of being that is an expression of embracing God's invitation to wealth. Now, there's some challenges. We have to be creative. We have to be open. We have to think outside the box and be countercultural. But I think every single follower of Christ can live a wealthy life. Some of the wealthiest people that I know, they don't own a single asset. We think about, women serving the Lord in monasteries. Some of those women are wealthy beyond belief because they have everything that they could ever want, anything that could ever need, it is provided for them. They have all the leisure in the world to devote themselves to the work of the Lord. And I think that's God's invitation. That's a picture of what it could look like to live a wealthy life.
And how does that change the way that we use our finances? How does that even just change the way that we think about what it looks like to engage with rest on a regular basis? That I don't have to save up this huge pile of money to be able to take a legitimately restful, family honoring, God honoring, restorative vacation, and to not be thrown off the scent of wealth with riches. And I think that's a really helpful juxtaposition that you provide for us there of comparing those two things. What's a final piece of advice that you would give to an alum who's just graduated, is stepping into the working world, and is trying to figure out how to develop healthy rhythms of rest, especially in the realm of vacation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I was leaving my business to come on staff with InterVarsity, I had a rather unorthodox supervisor who I loved to death. He's now gone to be with the Lord. And he would always have this phrase that really bothered me. He would always say, "Don't despise the day of small things." And I was a driver, and I was a type A and an ENTJ, and I'm going to win the world for Christ, and don't slow me down with your nonsense. And and then I encountered real life and how difficult and challenging things can be, and how students stand you up for discipleship appointments, and universities cancel your room reservation at the last
Yeah.
minute, and a pastor gets sick and can't show up to preach at your thing. And all of a sudden, this small things theology began to make sense to me. And I think whether or not you're going on staff with InterVarsity, or you're pastoring a church, or you're starting at an accounting firm, whatever your career path is, don't despise the day of small things. The things that you're going to learn in the early stages of your career, if you'll allow the Lord to come into that story and give you his perspective, they can actually launch you into a very fruitful and sometimes lucrative, but the point is a very fruitful career path. You're being swept into a story. And there's a counter narrative that you're going to be fed, and you're already being fed that even when you step, foot on the university. This counter narrative is really about your selfish ambition, your personal contribution to the world, the legacy you're going to leave to your kids. I call that second kingdom stuff. And here's what I mean by second kingdom stuff. There's this primary kingdom, the kingdom of Jesus Christ. At the end of the age in the apocalypse, no one's going to remember York Moore or InterVarsity or the Coalition for Christian Outreach, all the flags that we wave.
Yes.
You know what? It's just going to be Jesus on that throne. But the reality is that oftentimes what we do is we say yes to Jesus. Jesus is my Lord. And then we try to carve out a second sub-kingdom for ourselves. I want to leave a legacy. I want to make an impact. I want to change the world. And it sounds like godly ambition, but really what we're trying to do is we're trying to carve out a second kingdom for ourselves. So don't despise the day of small things. Invite Christ into your story. Realize that you're in a story. You're being swept into a bigger redemptive story where God is in the process of redeeming all things, and every square inch matters to him. And he's inviting you to co-redeem the world. We know that his death on the cross and the power of his resurrection is really what changes the world. That's the power that changes the world. But a woman or man who takes that into their lives now all of a sudden has the resurrection power. They are part of this redemptive story. So allow God to sweep you into a bigger story that's bigger than your career. It's bigger than your paycheck, especially when you see what the government's going to take out. Boy, I have a 24-year-old who's a scientist now. He graduated from the University of Michigan. I might have mentioned that my wife and I went there, and so go blue. But he got his first big boy paycheck. and it was much smaller than he thought because of taxes. And I said, "Well, welcome to the real world." But here's the thing, John. Right? Like the main thing that I'm trying to say is that there is a bigger story that's playing out, and at the end of the day, you do matter, and the work that you do does matter. But allow Christ to invite you into the bigger story where your story actually makes sense because of the story that he's writing throughout human history. And if you'll do that, you'll find contentment, you'll find joy, you'll find purpose. And I think, furthermore, you'll find moments where God is going to exalt you for his kingdom purposes because the favor of the Lord is upon you.
Wow. York, that is fantastic. I mean, what an invitation for people who are just on the beginning steps of this long journey of life after graduation, to be able to think about it in terms like that, and to say like, okay, where are the places that establishing rhythms of rest helps feed into Jesus on the throne, not me, not carving out a secondary kingdom, but stepping back and saying, your kingdom, Lord. Those are such good words for our alumni who are in these beginning stages of life, of this next part of life. And York, thank you so much for stepping in and for offering your experience and your wisdom in this realm, and for making this investment in InterVarsity alumni, who I know that you do and have loved for a long time already. Absolutely. So thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure, John. Good to be with you.
All right, I think everything York shared with us today gets filed under that final word. In the end, Jesus will be the one sitting on the throne. And that reality should influence the way we live every part of our lives, which includes our vacation rhythms as part of a larger theology of rest and leisure. When Jesus sits on the throne, I can stop. I can pull back. I can rest. Even when I'm just getting started at work and I want to make a good impression, I can lean into healthy rhythms of vacation, and I can rely on Jesus to keep moving, even when I stop. And when Jesus sits on the throne, it impacts the way I think about vacation. What activities are actually restful and lead me to restoration and connection with my Creator? No matter the budget or the resources available for planning a vacation, those are some of the questions we should be considering, because they're going to help lead us into healthy, meaningful rest. York, thank you so much for joining us this week. Blessings on your ministry with the Coalition for Christian Outreach, and keep rocking it on TikTok. Alumni, come back next week as we wrap up our summer series on rest. We're going to talk about extremely simple daily rhythms that can ground us in rest as our starting point, and not just as something that we have to earn through a day, a week, or some other lengthy season of hard work. This conversation will be full of practices that you can start using immediately, because they're things you're already familiar with, to lean into rest every single day. And don't forget to visit the giving link in the show notes during this last week of June and help support more of your favorite alumni podcast, After 4. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you in the After, alumni. Hey, thanks so much for joining us today, alumni. If there was anything that you learned, really enjoyed, or that encouraged you from today's episode, would you send us a DM or tag us in a story? We'd love to hear about it. You can find us at After4Pod on Instagram and Facebook. And if you haven't already, take just a second to unlock your phone and subscribe to the podcast. If your platform lets you, leave us a rating and a review. And if you like what we're doing here, share us with your InterVarsity or other post-graduation friends. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you in the After, alumni. Hey alumni, this is John Steele, your host and post-graduation guide. Before you jump to your next episode of After 4, I'm wondering, would you consider giving a gift to After 4? During the month of June, our team is working to raise $50,000 so that we can keep bringing you After 4, our other alumni podcast, InterVarsity World Changers, and a host of other alumni resources. All the work we do here is possible because alumni like you and other ministry partners make it happen through your financial support. We love getting to develop these resources for you. So if this podcast has blessed you or someone you know, or if you just like the idea of helping alumni make the transition to life after graduation, please, during the month of June, consider following the giving link in the show notes and help us continue making more of your favorite alumni podcast, After 4. Thanks, alumni. We're grateful for your support.